We don't need stubborn old farmers with outdated methods wasting our time at a premier agricultural investment conference. The cruel words hung in the air as 68-year-old Harrison Miller stood frozen in humiliation at the back of the luxurious conference hall. But 25 minutes later, when a helicopter landed on the building's rooftop helipad, Victor Blackwood's smug expression shattered as the commanding figure who emerged introduced himself. "I'm Alexander Miller, CEO of GreenHarvest Global, Harrison, Miller's son, and I believe we need to discuss your dismissal of sustainable farming practices before you finalize another corporate acquisition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." Emerald Valley Agriculture Summit stood as a monument to the industrialization of farming in the heart of the Midwest. Its gleaming modern convention center and corporate exhibition halls represented the changing face of American agriculture, where family farms were increasingly being absorbed by multinational conglomerates. The original farming families who had worked the region's fertile soil for generations now found themselves outmaneuvered and marginalized in the very communities they had helped build. Victor Blackwood's agricultural investment symposiums were considered the most influential events in the industry. At 52, with his custom Italian suits and international connections, he had transformed what was once a straightforward regional farm equipment show into an exclusive event where billion-dollar acquisitions were negotiated over fine dining. His reputation for delivering optimized agricultural assets to corporate investors, farms without complications from local resistance or environmental restrictions, had made him the preferred facilitator for agribusiness giants. The summit's main convention hall reflected this philosophy. Sophisticated digital displays showing yield projections, sleek multimedia presentations on economies of scale, and a raised platform where Blackwood could oversee the proceedings with commanding authority. A banner stretched across the back wall proclaimed maximum returns from agricultural investments. Blackwood moved through the gathering crowd on a crisp September morning, his handmade leather shoes marking him as distinctly different from the few remaining independent farmers who had come to witness the presentation of yet another consolidation opportunity. "Today," he announced as he took his position at the podium, "we present an extraordinary investment opportunity, the Clearwater Basin Agricultural Portfolio, 5,000 contiguous acres of prime farmland with exceptional development, potential and water rights. We'll start the bidding at $45 million. The attendees, mostly representatives from agricultural conglomerates and investment firms, settled into their plush seats. The Clearwater Basin was known throughout the region for its exceptional fertility and strategic location near planned transportation infrastructure. Its acquisition would give any large operation a dominant position in the county. The conference hall doors opened quietly, and an elderly man in worn denim overalls and a faded plaid shirt stepped inside. Harrison Miller, 68, moved slowly toward the back row, his weathered hands clutching a leather-bound notebook that had clearly seen decades of use. His clear blue eyes surveyed the room with quiet dignity, taking in the transformation of the agricultural conference he had attended since his youth, back when it was focused on innovations that helped family farms thrive rather than initiatives to replace them. Blackwood noticed the newcomer and frowned slightly before continuing his elaborate description of the property's investment potential, highlighting projected returns when converted from traditional farming to more intensive industrial production. As the bidding began, corporate representatives raised the price in $500,000 increments as Blackwood orchestrated the proceedings with practiced precision, emphasizing the rare opportunity to acquire such a significant land position in a single transaction. During a brief pause between bids, Harrison raised his hand. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying surprising strength despite his age. "There's an important watershed protection agreement on the eastern section that restricts certain agricultural practices." A murmur ran through the crowd as Blackwood's smile tightened. "Sir, we've thoroughly vetted all legal aspects of these properties. If you're not here to bid, I must ask you to refrain from disrupting the proceedings." "I'm not trying to disrupt," Harrison replied calmly, "but I helped establish that water conservation covenant in 1988. It was registered with 3 counties to protect the aquifer that supplies water to over a dozen communities." Blackwood's irritation became visible. "Sir, our legal team has cleared all titles. Unless you're prepared to participate with a minimum bid of $45 million, I must ask you to remain silent." Harrison persisted quietly. "The covenant exists. Anyone buying that land should know they can't implement factory farming methods on the eastern quadrant. It protects the water supply for thousands of people downstream." Blackwood stepped away from his podium, approaching Harrison directly. "Mr. Miller, Harrison Miller? Mr. Miller, this is a premier investment conference for serious agricultural investors. We're not here to debate forgotten handshake agreements or sentimental attachments to outdated farming methods. The legal details have been handled by professionals. I was on the Tri-County Water Conservation Board for 18 years, Harrison explained. That covenant exists to protect. What it exists to do, Blackwood interrupted coldly, is irrelevant. These properties will be sold today, and the buyers will develop them according to modern agricultural practices, not some gentleman's agreement from 35 years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harrison opened his notebook. It wasn't a gentleman's agreement. I have the original documentation right here, signed by 3 county commissioners and registered with the State Water Authority. Security, Blackwood called over his shoulder. Please escort this gentleman out. He's disrupting a private business event. 2 men in dark suits approached as surprised whispers rippled through the room. I'm simply providing relevant information about the property, Harrison protested mildly. Potential buyers deserve to know about legal restrictions that could affect their operations. Blackwood's voice took on a dismissive tone intended to be heard by his wealthy clients. Mr. Miller, I understand that watching these agricultural transitions must be difficult for certain traditional farmers, but this is the nature of progress. We don't need stubborn old farmers with outdated methods wasting our time at a premier agricultural investment conference. A pained expression crossed Harrison's face at the public humiliation, but he carefully closed his notebook and stood with dignity. My methods may be outdated, Mr. Blackwood, but so is your understanding of this land and its importance to our watershed. The industry is evolving, Mr. Miller. Perhaps it's time you accepted that not everyone belongs in modern agriculture. Blackwood turned to the security personnel. Please see Mr. Miller out. We have valuable clients whose time we're wasting. As Harrison was escorted toward the door, he paused and looked back at the room full of investors. That covenant exists whether you acknowledge it or not. The land remembers how it's treated, even when people choose to forget. Blackwood returned to his podium with a practiced smile. My apologies for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. Some people struggle to accept that farming, like any industry, belongs to those who apply the most efficient methods. Now, shall we continue with Parcel B? Outside in the parking lot, Harrison stood beside his well-maintained but clearly aging pickup truck, his face composed despite the humiliation he had just endured. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Alex, it's Dad. I'm sorry to bother you when I know you're in the middle of your board meeting, but there's a situation at the Emerald Valley Summit. Blackwood Investments is selling the Clearwater Basin without disclosing the watershed covenant. He listened for a moment. No, don't worry about that. They just asked me to leave. Yes, I'm fine. Just concerned about the water protection for all those downstream communities. As Harrison ended the call, he didn't notice Victor Blackwood watching from the conference center window, a satisfied smirk on his face as he saw the old farmer climbing into his weathered truck. In Blackwood's mind, he had just eliminated a potential complication to his perfectly orchestrated land sale. He had no idea that his smug certainty was about to be shattered in less than 25 minutes. The investment symposium resumed its steady rhythm after Harrison Miller's departure. Victor Blackwood had quickly re-established control of the room, his confidence seemingly unshaken by the brief disruption. Corporate representatives continued their bidding on the fertile parcels of Clearwater Basin, with prices climbing well, beyond what any independent farmer could hope to match. Parcel C includes the original homestead and surrounding 800 acres, Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man who knew he was about to make a substantial commission. This section features excellent drainage and soil quality, perfect for high-intensity row cropping. We'll start the bidding at $12 million. In the parking lot, Harrison sat in his truck, his weathered hands still gripping the steering wheel. He hadn't started the engine yet. Instead, he was looking at an old photograph tucked into the sun visor, a picture of a much younger Harrison standing with his late wife and their young son Alexander beside the Clearwater River that ran through their former family farm. Harrison wasn't fighting for his own property anymore. That battle had been lost 7 years earlier, when drought and medical bills had forced him to sell the farm that had been in his family for 4 generations. He was fighting for the principles that had governed responsible farming in the region for generations. The understanding that water was a shared resource that demanded stewardship rather than exploitation. The Watershed Protection Covenant he had helped establish with neighboring farmers had been designed to protect not just the river itself, but the entire aquifer that sustained dozens of communities downstream. Industrial farming with heavy pesticide use and intensive irrigation would eventually contaminate a water source that thousands of people relied upon. His reverie was interrupted by the distant sound of an approaching helicopter. Harrison glanced up and was startled to see a sleek black helicopter with the GreenHarvest Global logo emblazoned on its side, approaching the conference center's rooftop helipad. "Oh, Alex," Harrison murmured, recognizing his son's corporate aircraft. "You didn't have to come yourself." Inside the conference hall, Blackwood was in his element, having just secured a $13.5 million bid on the homestead parcel. "Excellent, that's $13.5 million from Heartland Agricultural Investments. Do I hear $14 million? Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is prime conversion property with historical value that exempts it from certain zoning restrictions." A representative from Continental Agri-Systems raised his paddle. $14 million. I have $14 million. Do I hear? Blackwood's patter was interrupted by the sound of helicopter rotors directly overhead. The conference hall's large windows offered a clear view of the rooftop, where attendees could now see a helicopter touching down on the helipad. "As I was saying," Blackwood continued, attempting to recapture the room's attention, "we have $14 million. Do I hear $14.5 million? But the bidders were distracted now, murmuring amongst themselves as they watched the helicopter doors open and several people in business attire exit onto the rooftop. "Is that Alexander Miller?" someone whispered loudly enough to be heard throughout the room. "The GreenHarvest CEO?" Blackwood's confident demeanor faltered momentarily. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, we have important business to conduct. I'm sure whatever executive is arriving today has their own meetings to attend. Now, do I hear $14.5 million for the homestead parcel?" The conference hall doors swung open and two corporate security personnel entered, scanning the room with professional detachment. Behind them came a man in his late 40s, his tailored, sustainable fiber suit and commanding presence immediately drawing all eyes in the room. Alexander Miller had his father's clear blue eyes and the same quiet dignity, though his was now amplified by the authority that came with running one of the world's largest sustainable agriculture corporations. Flanking him were his chief sustainability officer and GreenHarvest's general counsel, both carrying digital tablets. Harrison Miller entered last, looking somewhat embarrassed by the dramatic entrance, but resolute nonetheless. Blackwood's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions. Surprise, confusion, alarm, and finally an attempt at professional courtesy. "Mr. Miller, this is an unexpected honor. We're in the middle of an investment symposium, but of course, you're welcome to observe. Perhaps your team would like to place a bid on behalf of GreenHarvest." Alexander ignored Blackwood entirely, instead turning to address the room at large. "Good morning, everyone. I apologize for interrupting your proceedings, but an urgent matter of public interest has come to my attention." His voice carried natural authority without raising its volume. "I've been informed that this symposium may be proceeding without full disclosure of legal encumbrances on the Clearwater Basin properties." Blackwood moved quickly from behind his podium. "Mr. Miller, I assure you that all legal requirements have been meticulously followed. Our title research is impeccable. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Blackwood," Alexander replied coolly. "I've just spoken with the State Water Resources Board. They've confirmed the existence of a watershed protection covenant on significant portions of the Clearwater Basin, specifically parcels A, C, and E of your current offering." The General Counsel stepped forward, opening his tablet to display documents. "We have certified digital copies of the covenant documents right here, filed in 1988 and never rescinded. The covenant explicitly prohibits high-intensity industrial agriculture on the eastern quadrant and requires maintenance of the existing riparian buffers along all waterways." A wave of murmurs swept through the audience, particularly among the corporate bidders who had already committed millions to parcels that now appeared to have significant restrictions. Blackwood's confident facade began to crack. "Mr. Miller, with all due respect, my legal team conducted thorough due diligence. If such a covenant exists, it would have been disclosed in our materials." "It should have been," Alexander agreed, "which raises serious questions about your investment practices. Either your legal team missed critical encumbrances, which constitutes negligence, or these restrictions were deliberately omitted, which would constitute fraud." The room had gone completely silent now, all eyes moving between Blackwood and Alexander Miller. "I don't appreciate these insinuations, Mr. Miller," Blackwood said, struggling to maintain his composure. "These properties have been properly vetted according to standard industry practices." "Industry practices don't supersede water protection. Laws, Mr. Blackwood," the General Counsel interjected, "and state law requires full disclosure of all encumbrances before sale." Alexander turned to address the bidders directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of transparency and to prevent any of you from making investments based on incomplete information, I'm requesting a temporary halt to these proceedings, pending a full review of the property records." He nodded to the GreenHarvest security personnel, who moved to stand on either side of Blackwood's podium. "This is not an action I take lightly, but as CEO of a company committed to sustainable agriculture, I have a responsibility to ensure that all farmland transactions adhere to environmental protections, particularly when they involve resources as vital as our watershed." Blackwood looked around desperately, seeking support from the crowd, but the corporate representatives were already on their phones, clearly consulting with their legal departments. This is unprecedented interference in a private business transaction, he protested. On the contrary, Alexander replied calmly, this is responsible business leadership, ensuring that all parties have accurate information before making significant investments. My father attempted to provide this information through appropriate channels, and you had him removed. All eyes turned to Harrison Miller, who stood quietly at the back of the room, still clutching his leather notebook. There was a moment of collective realization as the bidders connected the elderly farmer with the GreenHarvest CEO. Your father, Blackwood stammered, the color draining from his face as he finally made the connection himself. Yes, Mr. Blackwood. Harrison Miller, the stubborn old farmer with outdated methods you so dismissively ejected, is my father. He served on the Tri-County Water Conservation Board for 18 years and helped draft the very covenant you failed to disclose. Alexander's voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath his calm exterior. More importantly, he was trying to ensure that all parties to this sale had accurate information about legal restrictions that could affect their operations, something you actively prevented. Blackwood looked desperately toward his legal counsel, who had sunk low in his chair, already recognizing the severity of the situation. Mr. Miller, Blackwood began, attempting to recover, had I known Harrison Miller was your father? Had you known? Alexander interrupted sharply. Would you have treated him with the respect every farmer deserves? Would you have dismissed his concerns because of his clothes or his age? Or would you have listened only because of his connection to me? Blackwood had no answer. Your symposium is suspended pending review, Alexander continued. GreenHarvest's legal team will be examining all sales conducted by Blackwood Investments over the past 5 years to ensure proper disclosure practices were followed. He turned to the assembled bidders. I apologize for any inconvenience this causes to those of you who traveled here in good faith. We will ensure that when these properties are eventually sold, all legal encumbrances will be clearly documented. As the corporate representatives began gathering their materials and filing out, many casting accusatory glances at Blackwood, the facilitator made one last desperate attempt. Mr. Miller, surely we can resolve this without such drastic measures. Perhaps a brief recess to review the documentation your father has provided. Mr. Blackwood, Alexander said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his corporate authority, this isn't merely about documentation. It's about the systematic dismissal of local knowledge and the disregard for environmental protections that has characterized too many agricultural transactions in this region. My company has received numerous complaints about your investment practices, but until today, we lacked clear evidence. He gestured to the security personnel. These officers will secure the symposium records while our legal team conducts their initial review. You're welcome to contact your attorney, but I suggest you cooperate fully. As the room quickly emptied, Harrison Miller approached his son, Alexander. I didn't call you to shut down the symposium, Harrison said quietly. I just wanted someone to verify the covenant's existence. Alexander smiled at his father, briefly dropping his executive demeanor. I know, Dad, but when you told me they'd thrown you out for trying to share vital information about the property, it confirmed what we've been hearing about Blackwood's practices for years. He lowered his voice. We've had complaints from farmers in 5 counties about his failure to disclose environmental restrictions and indigenous heritage sites on properties he's facilitated selling. We just needed clear evidence. Harrison glanced over at Blackwood, who was now engaged in an intense conversation with his legal counsel. He's built quite a business, selling off our region's farmland piece by piece. Well, that business model is about to change, Alexander replied. Our legal team has been looking for a case like this to establish stronger disclosure requirements for agricultural land sales. Across the room, Blackwood looked up and caught Harrison's eye. The investment facilitator's expression had transformed, from smugness to something approaching fear, as he watched the GreenHarvest team boxing up his records. In the span of 25 minutes, his carefully constructed world of exclusive deals and selective disclosures had begun to crumble. Harrison felt no triumph, only quiet satisfaction that the watershed might now be treated with the respect it deserved. He opened his weathered notebook, showing his son the original covenant language he had helped draft decades earlier. "The land remembers," he said softly, echoing the words he had spoken when being escorted out. "Even when people try to forget," Alexander nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in his father's words. "And sometimes," he added, "it just needs someone willing to speak for it." Outside, the GreenHarvest helicopter remained visible on the rooftop, a powerful symbol that even in changing times, some principles remained worth defending. This confrontation at the Emerald Valley Summit would eventually transform not just Victor Blackwood's business practices, but the entire approach to agricultural investment throughout the region, creating a new model where environmental stewardship and economic prosperity could flourish together rather than at each other's expense. But that transformation was still to come. For now, father and son stood together, an unlikely alliance between traditional farming wisdom and modern corporate leadership, united by their shared commitment to protecting the land that sustained them all. The weeks following Alexander Miller's dramatic intervention at the Emerald Valley Summit brought profound changes to the agricultural investment landscape throughout the region. What had begun as a confrontation over a single property quickly expanded into a broader examination of land sale practices throughout the Midwest. For Victor Blackwood, the transformation was both professional and personal, beginning with the most uncomfortable meeting of his career. 3 days after the suspended symposium, Blackwood found himself sitting in GreenHarvest Global's headquarters conference room, surrounded by officials from various agricultural and environmental regulatory agencies. The state's Attorney General presided, flanked by water conservation officers and representatives from the Sustainable Farming Alliance. "Mr. Blackwood," the Attorney General began, "our preliminary review has identified concerning patterns in your investment disclosures. Of the 38 farm properties your company has facilitated selling in the past 3 years, 22 appear to have had environmental covenants or water rights restrictions that were not properly disclosed to buyers." Blackwood shifted, uncomfortably in his expensive suit, acutely aware that his usual intimidating presence held no power here. "Those were oversights, not deliberate omissions," he insisted. "Agricultural property transactions are complex, and which is precisely why proper disclosure is essential," interrupted the representative from the Sustainable Farming Alliance. "Buyers rely on your expertise and due diligence, particularly when they're corporate entities unfamiliar with local land conditions and legal restrictions." Blackwood nodded mechanically, understanding the precarious position he now occupied. The state could revoke his business license, effectively ending his lucrative empire overnight. "We're not here to put you out of business, Mr. Blackwood," the Attorney General continued, as if reading his thoughts. "We're here to ensure that moving forward, all land transactions include full transparency about legal encumbrances and environmental responsibilities." What stung most wasn't the threat of punishment, but the realization that his professional reputation, built over decades of careful cultivation, was now tarnished. The prestigious clients who had once sought his exclusive services were suddenly distant, unwilling to be associated with controversial business practices. "We are implementing new protocols for agricultural property transfers statewide," explained the Water Conservation Board representative. "All properties will undergo independent environmental assessment before sale, with results made available to all potential bidders." As the meeting concluded, the Attorney General remained behind, fixing Blackwood with a penetrating gaze. Alexander Miller could have pursued this matter far more aggressively. He chose instead to focus on systemic reform rather than individual penalties. Blackwood managed a tight smile. "I appreciate his restraint." "It wasn't restraint, Mr. Blackwood. It was wisdom. Mr. Miller believes you have expertise that could benefit the transition to more sustainable agricultural practices, assuming you're willing to adapt your business model." The comment stayed with Blackwood as he drove back to his office, the rolling countryside passing outside his car window. For the first time in years, he really looked at the land not as investment parcels to be flipped for profit, but as a living system that Harrison Miller had tried to protect. The following morning, Blackwood arrived at his office earlier than usual, finding several cancellation emails from corporate clients unwilling to risk association with his firm until the state investigation concluded. As he contemplated the potential collapse of his business empire, his assistant announced an unexpected visitor. "Mr. Miller is here to see you," she said, her tone suggesting she was as surprised by this development as Blackwood himself. Blackwood expected to see Alexander, the powerful CEO, but instead, Harrison Miller entered his office with the same quiet dignity he had shown at the symposium, his weathered hands still carrying the small leather notebook. Without the pressure of the auction environment, Blackwood noticed details he had previously overlooked: the intelligence in the old farmer's eyes, the careful precision in his movements, the subtle indicators of a lifetime spent in thoughtful stewardship of the land. "Mr. Miller," Blackwood said, standing awkwardly, "I didn't expect to see you again." "I expect not," Harrison replied without rancor. "But I thought we should talk man to man without all the government officials and corporate lawyers present." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them before Blackwood gestured to a chair. "Please sit down." Harrison settled into the chair, placing his notebook on the desk between them. "I've been thinking about what happened at the symposium," he began. "You're not the first to dismiss the concerns of an old farmer, and you won't be the last. But there's an opportunity here that might benefit us both." Blackwood raised an eyebrow skeptically. "I'm listening." "The Clearwater Basin is still going to be sold," Harrison explained, opening his notebook. "But whoever buys it needs to understand its complexities, not just the legal restrictions, but the practical knowledge of how the watershed functions, which fields drain first after heavy rains, where the natural springs lie, information that doesn't appear in official records." Blackwood nodded, acknowledging the point. "Information that you possess." "Exactly. I've spent my life observing that land. So have other farmers in this region. We carry knowledge that no satellite mapping or soil sample can provide." Harrison tapped his notebook. "I've documented seasonal changes, water patterns, and soil conditions across 4 decades. This knowledge has value, not to stop development, but to ensure it proceeds intelligently." Blackwood studied the older man, beginning to understand. "You're suggesting a partnership of some kind?" "A collaboration," Harrison corrected. "Your company provides the market expertise, the connections to investors. But moving forward, you incorporate local knowledge and environmental stewardship into your sales approach, not as restrictions, but as value-added insights." The idea was so different from Blackwood's usual business model that his initial instinct was to dismiss it. But recent events had made it abundantly clear that his traditional approach was no longer viable in the changing regulatory environment. "Your son mentioned something similar," Blackwood admitted. "He suggested my expertise could contribute to sustainable agricultural transitions." Harrison nodded. "Alexander sees the bigger picture. This isn't about punishing you or stopping progress. It's about ensuring that progress respects the land's natural systems." Blackwood found himself considering the proposal seriously. His Business was at a crossroads. Continue fighting against the tide of environmental regulations and transparency requirements, or adapt and possibly discover new opportunities. "I'd need to completely restructure my approach," he said, thinking aloud. "My clients expect unrestricted properties they can develop however they choose." "And how's that working out for them?" Harrison asked mildly. "The Westridge development that Continental built 2 years ago has faced constant irrigation problems because they ignored the natural aquifer dynamics. The Eastland Farm conversion to industrial production has ongoing soil erosion issues because they removed the windbreaks." Blackwood was surprised by the old farmer's detailed knowledge of recent developments. "You've been paying attention." "These are my neighbors, Mr. Blackwood. I may have lost my own farm, but I still care about this region." Harrison leaned forward. "What if your investment symposiums included comprehensive land management plans alongside the property deeds? What if buyers received not just legal titles, but ecological understanding?" The conversation continued for over 2 hours, evolving from tentative idea to concrete proposal. By the time Harrison Miller left Blackwood's office, something fundamental had shifted in the facilitator's perspective. The land was no longer just a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder, but a complex living system with needs and patterns that any responsible owner should understand. That evening, Blackwood drove to the outskirts of town, where the Clearwater River wound through what had once been the Miller family farm. Parking his luxury sedan on a gravel pull-off, he walked along the riverbank, seeing the land through new eyes. The setting sun illuminated the rolling fields, stretching toward the horizon, land that had been tended by generations of farmers who understood that ownership was temporary, but stewardship was eternal. For the first time, he felt a connection to the soil beneath his feet that went beyond financial valuation. Taking out his phone, he made a call he never thought he would make. "Alexander, it's Victor Blackwood. I believe your father and I may have found a way forward. Do you have time to meet tomorrow?" 3 months later, a very different kind of agricultural investment event took place at the renovated Emerald Valley Convention Center. The banner above the entrance read, "Sustainable Farming Investment Summit, Partnering for Prosperity and Stewardship." Inside, the transformation was immediately apparent. Where once there had been only corporate representatives in business attire, now there was a diverse mix of attendees: investment professionals alongside family farmers, environmental scientists next to agricultural technology companies. Victor Blackwood, dressed in a more modest suit than his former signature style, stood at the entrance greeting attendees. Instead of the dismissive gatekeeper he had once been, he now served as a bridge between different worlds. "Welcome to the new approach," he said to a group of potential investors. "Before the bidding begins, I'd like to introduce you to some people who know these properties better than anyone." He led them to a section where Harrison Miller and several other senior farmers sat at consultation tables, their notebooks and maps spread out before them. Each wore a badge that read, "Land Knowledge Consultant." "Mr. Miller can tell you more about the seasonal water patterns on the eastern parcels than any environmental impact report," Blackwood explained. "That knowledge will save you millions in development costs and prevent ecological damage." The investors, initially skeptical, soon found themselves deeply engaged in conversation with the farmers, discovering that local knowledge provided insights that no amount of technical analysis could replace. Across the room, Alexander Miller observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. When Blackwood had called him with the proposed collaboration, he had been skeptical. But seeing the transformation unfold, not just in the event format, but in Blackwood himself, he recognized the potential for genuine change. "Your father's idea is actually working," remarked GreenHarvest's chief sustainability officer, watching as a corporate agriculture representative earnestly discussed riparian buffer zones with an elderly farmer. Dad always said that if you show people the value of stewardship, they'll choose it voluntarily, Alexander replied. The problem was that traditional farming wisdom was being systematically excluded from the conversation. The centerpiece of the event was the introduction of the Miller-Blackwood Protocol, a comprehensive framework for agricultural property transfers that incorporated both environmental sustainability and economic viability. The protocol required thorough documentation of local knowledge, transparent disclosure of all ecological factors, and the development of long-term stewardship plans as part of every transaction. When it came time for Blackwood to address the gathering, the change in his approach was evident to everyone who had known him before. For most of my career, he began, I viewed agricultural land as simply another asset class to be optimized for maximum short-term returns. I failed to recognize that land carries multiple forms of value: economic, ecological, cultural, and historical. He gestured toward Harrison and the other farmer consultants. These men and women possess generations of accumulated wisdom about the properties we're discussing today. That wisdom isn't an impediment to progress. It's essential for sustainable success. In the audience, several representatives from major agricultural corporations looked skeptical, but many others were nodding in agreement, particularly those who had experienced costly failures from ignoring local conditions. Today, we're not just selling property, Blackwood continued. We're transferring stewardship. The parcels available include comprehensive ecological assessments, local knowledge documentation, and sustainable management plans developed in consultation with the farmers who know these lands best. Harrison watched from his consultation table, hardly believing the transformation in the man who had once had him escorted from the building. When Blackwood had first approached him with the idea of collaboration, he had been deeply skeptical. But something in the investment facilitator's humble demeanor had convinced him to give the idea a chance. As the first property came up for bid, something remarkable happened. Instead of focusing exclusively on price, the bidders began asking questions about sustainability features, water management plans, and soil health initiatives. The value proposition had shifted from mere ownership to responsible stewardship. By the end of the day, all 8 properties had sold, most for prices comparable to what they would have commanded under the old system. The difference was that each sale now included comprehensive environmental protections and stewardship commitments that would preserve the land's health for generations to come. After the event, Harrison found Blackwood standing alone, looking out over the convention center's balcony toward the distant hills. "Well, Mr. Blackwood," Harrison said, joining him at the railing, "it appears your experiment was a success." Blackwood nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It was your experiment, Mr. Miller. I just had the sense to listen, belatedly." "Better late than never," Harrison replied without irony. "You know what surprised me most?" Blackwood said after a moment of silence, that incorporating all these environmental considerations didn't actually reduce the property's values. In several cases, it enhanced them. Harrison smiled. Good stewardship isn't just an ethical choice. It's good business. Healthy soil produces better yields. Clean water reduces operational costs. Biodiversity creates resilience against pests and disease. These aren't just environmental ideals, they're practical advantages. Blackwood turned to face the older man directly. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Miller, not just for having you removed from the symposium, but for dismissing your knowledge so completely." Harrison waved away the apology. "What matters is what we do moving forward. Will you continue with this approach?" "I don't think I have much choice," Blackwood admitted with a rueful smile. "But more importantly, I don't think I would want to go back to the old way. For the first time in my career, I feel like I'm contributing something meaningful, beyond just facilitating transactions." As they stood together looking out over the land that had been the source of their conflict and now the foundation of their collaboration, Alexander Miller approached, carrying 3 glasses and a bottle of locally produced apple cider. "I think this calls for a toast," he said, pouring the golden liquid, "to unlikely partnerships." Harrison raised his glass. "To the land that sustains us all." Blackwood completed the trio, "and to the wisdom to listen before it's too late." As the sun set over the fertile fields of the region, the 3 men, once adversaries, now allies, shared a moment of quiet appreciation for the transformation they had begun. It was just one agricultural investment summit in one region, but it represented a fundamental shift in how people valued and transferred the land that fed them. In that moment, Victor Blackwood understood that his greatest professional achievement wouldn't be measured in commissions or transaction volumes, but in helping to create a new model that honored both prosperity and stewardship. A model that might preserve the region's agricultural heritage for generations to come. And it had all begun with the humiliation of having an elderly farmer escorted from his symposium, a mistake that had ultimately led to his most important insight, that true value comes not from exploiting resources, but from honoring the wisdom of those who understand them best. 5 years later, the Clearwater Basin Sustainable Agriculture Center opened its doors on a perfect spring morning, the kind that farmers throughout the region recognized as ideal planting weather. The renovated historic barn that once stood at the heart of the Miller family farm now served as the centerpiece of a community institution dedicated to regenerative farming practices and the preservation of agricultural knowledge. Outside, a diverse crowd gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Local farmers in work clothes mingled with corporate executives in business attire. Environmental advocates chatted with agricultural investors, and families from throughout the county explored interactive exhibits about watershed protection. They stood together on land that had nearly become another anonymous industrial operation, but instead had transformed into something unique, a working demonstration farm, educational center and community gathering place. Alexander Miller, now in his early 50s and recently featured on the cover of Business Innovator magazine for GreenHarvest's revolutionary approach to agricultural investment, approached the podium set up on the barn's wide porch. At 53, he carried the same commanding presence that had stopped an investment symposium in its tracks 5 years earlier, though responsibility had added a few strands of silver to his temples. "Welcome, everyone, to what I believe represents the future of American agriculture," he began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. 5 years ago, this property stood at the center of a controversy about how we value farmland and whose knowledge counts when making decisions about its use. In the front row, 73-year-old Harrison Miller sat with quiet dignity, his weathered hands resting on a familiar leather notebook. Beside him, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the place of honor, but present nonetheless, sat Victor Blackwood, whose transformation had become almost as legendary as the confrontation that sparked it. "Today," Alexander continued, "the Clearwater Basin stands as a testament to what happens when we combine traditional wisdom with modern innovation, when we recognize that the highest value of land isn't always reflected in its sale price." Alexander gestured toward his father and Blackwood. "I want to acknowledge 2 men whose unlikely partnership made today possible. My father, Harrison Miller, who stood up for the watershed when it needed a voice, and Victor Blackwood, who demonstrated that true leadership often means having the courage to change course when presented with new understanding." The crowd applauded as both men nodded in acknowledgement, their former antagonism long since transformed into a productive working relationship that had reshaped agricultural land transfers throughout the region. After Blackwood's pioneering changes to his investment approach, other facilitators and real estate firms had initially mocked his unnecessary complications. But when buyers began specifically seeking out Blackwood's events for their comprehensive approach to land acquisition, competitors had quickly followed suit. What began as one man's reluctant adaptation had evolved into a new standard for agricultural property transfers. The Clearwater Basin Sustainable Agriculture Center represents more than just the preservation of this historic farm, Alexander continued. It embodies a new approach to land stewardship that recognizes the value of generational knowledge and the importance of maintaining ecological integrity alongside economic development. The center had already become a hub for the community in ways no one had initially imagined. Local schools brought students for hands-on agricultural education. Farmers from across the state came to learn about regenerative practices. Researchers used the demonstration fields to test climate-adaptive crop varieties. Even the corporate agricultural firms that had once viewed environmental considerations as mere obstacles now sent representatives to learn techniques that could reduce costs while improving land quality. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, as attendees explored the newly opened center, Harrison Miller found a quiet moment with his son near the small pond that had featured in their old family photograph. "Your mother would have loved this," he said softly, gazing across the carefully maintained wetlands that now served as both wildlife habitat and natural water filtration for the surrounding farms. Alexander smiled, placing his hand on his father's shoulder. "She always said you were stubborn enough for both of you. Turns out she was right." "Wasn't stubbornness," Harrison corrected gently. "Just knew the watershed deserved better than to be treated like a commodity with no inherent value beyond its price." "Well, that stubbornness has changed how we approach agricultural investment across 5 states, his son replied. The Miller-Blackwood Protocol is being adopted as standard practice throughout the Midwest. Now, the Miller-Blackwood Protocol, as it had come to be known in agricultural circles, established standards for farmland sales that included comprehensive environmental assessment, documentation of traditional knowledge, and transparent disclosure of all ecological implications. What had begun as a confrontation in a conference hall had evolved into a framework for balancing productivity with preservation. Across the gathering, Victor Blackwood was engaged in conversation with several young farmers eager to discuss the upcoming transfer of adjoining properties. At 57, Blackwood had transformed not just his business practices, but his entire approach to his role in the agricultural community. Where once he had viewed local farmers as obstacles to profitable transactions, he now saw them as essential partners in sustainable land management. The key, he was explaining to the group, is understanding that the value of agricultural land isn't just in its yield potential. It's in the accumulated knowledge of how that specific piece of earth functions within the larger ecosystem. One of the young farmers gestured toward Harrison Miller. "Mr. Miller has been helping us map the seasonal water patterns on our family's property. Some of those observations go back to my grandfather's time." Blackwood nodded appreciatively. "That kind of generational knowledge is invaluable. When we include it in property listings, buyers recognize they're getting more than just acreage. They're getting wisdom that can prevent costly mistakes." This approach had not just reformed land sales. It had begun healing the deep divisions between long-time agricultural families and more recent corporate investors by creating a framework that valued local knowledge and environmental stewardship. The Miller-Blackwood Protocol had established common ground between groups that had once viewed each other with suspicion and resentment. Later that afternoon, as the celebration continued, Blackwood found himself approached by a corporate representative he recognized from the original Clearwater Basin Symposium, one of the bidders who had been prepared to develop the property without regard for the watershed covenant. "Quite a change from 5 years ago," the man observed, gesturing toward the thriving demonstration farm that now occupied the land he had once hoped to purchase. Blackwood nodded. "I'd say for the better, wouldn't you?" "Surprisingly, yes." The representative looked thoughtful. "My firm was initially frustrated when the original symposium was halted, but watching how this property has been managed since then has actually influenced our approach to other agricultural investments. Turns out respecting the land's natural systems is good business." "Something Mr. Miller tried to tell us that day," Blackwood acknowledged. "We just weren't ready to listen." The celebration included the unveiling of a new agricultural scholarship program, the Harrison Miller Legacy Fund, dedicated to supporting young farmers committed to regenerative practices. Funded by a portion of the proceeds from each property transaction conducted under the Miller-Blackwood Protocol, the scholarship had already helped 15 young people pursue agricultural education. During the scholarship presentation, a young woman named Maya Johnson spoke about how the program had changed her life. Born and raised in an urban environment, she had never considered farming as a career until a high school field trip to the Clearwater Basin demonstration farm. "What I saw here wasn't the outdated agriculture I'd heard about," she told the gathered crowd. "I saw cutting-edge technology working in harmony with traditional wisdom. I saw a future where feeding people and protecting the earth weren't competing goals, but complementary ones." Now, in her second year of agricultural studies at the State University, Maya represented a new generation of farmers, bridging the gap between traditional practices and innovative approaches. "Mr. Miller showed me that the most sophisticated agricultural technology isn't a GPS-guided tractor or drone-based crop monitoring," she continued, gesturing toward Harrison. "It's the knowledge accumulated across generations of careful observation, knowledge that no computer algorithm can replace." Harrison, never comfortable with public recognition, nonetheless appeared deeply moved by Maya's words. The idea that his life's wisdom would continue through a new generation of farmers, committed to stewardship, represented a form of immortality more meaningful than any monument. As the day drew to a close, Alexander gathered the key stakeholders for a photograph in front of the renovated barn. Harrison Miller and other local farmers, Victor Blackwood and representatives from his reformed investment firm, the Sustainable Agriculture investors who had purchased portions of the Clearwater Basin, and researchers from the Agricultural Extension Service. They stood together, this unlikely alliance that had transformed not just a single property, but an entire approach to rural land management. "5 years ago, we stood as adversaries in a conference hall," Harrison remarked quietly to Blackwood, as they posed for the photograph. "Now look at us." Blackwood smiled, acknowledging the profound journey they had taken together. "Best mistake I ever made, throwing you out of that symposium." The photograph captured a moment of genuine collaboration among groups that had once been at odds, a visual representation of what was possible when financial interests and environmental stewardship were seen as complementary rather than competing values. That evening, a more intimate gathering took place in the center's conference room. Representatives from 3 neighboring states had come to discuss the expansion of the Miller-Blackwood Protocol beyond its original boundaries. The momentum behind the approach had grown as its economic and environmental benefits became increasingly evident. "The data from the first 5 years is compelling," explained the agricultural commissioner from a neighboring state. "Properties managed under the protocol show an average 23% reduction in water usage, 18% improvement in soil organic matter, and most surprisingly, a 15% increase in per-acre profitability compared to conventional operations. Alexander, serving as host for the discussion, directed attention to a series of comparative photographs showing the transformation of several properties under the protocol's guidance. These aren't just environmental improvements, he emphasized, they're business advantages. Healthier soil requires fewer inputs, better water management reduces irrigation costs, biodiversity decreases pest pressure. These ecological benefits translate directly to the bottom line. Victor Blackwood, who had initially agreed to the protocol primarily to salvage his business, now found himself its most passionate advocate. The economic data reinforced what he had discovered through experience, that sustainable practices often outperformed extractive ones over the medium and long term. When I first implemented these changes, Blackwood admitted to the group, I thought I was just adapting to new regulations. What I've discovered is an entirely new value proposition. We're not just selling land anymore, we're transferring functioning ecological systems that, when properly maintained, continuously regenerate their productivity. The visiting officials were particularly interested in how the protocol had been received by corporate agricultural interests, traditionally the most resistant to environmental considerations. Initially with skepticism, Alexander acknowledged, but the protocol doesn't ask anyone to sacrifice profit for principle. It demonstrates how principle enhances profit when you extend your time frame beyond the next quarterly report. Harrison, who had remained largely quiet during the technical discussions, finally spoke up. Farming has always been a long-term proposition. You plant an orchard, knowing you might not live to see its peak production. You build soil, knowing your grandchildren will benefit more than you will. The protocol simply formalizes what good farmers have always understood, that we don't really own the land, we're borrowing it from future generations. The simple wisdom of this statement seemed to resonate with everyone in the room, from government officials to corporate representatives. It cut through technical and financial complexities to the heart of the matter, the relationship between people and the land that sustains them. As the meeting concluded with commitments from all 3 states to begin implementing the protocol, Harrison excused himself and walked outside. The spring evening had turned cool, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He made his way to the small hill overlooking what had once been his family's land. Alexander found him there a few minutes later, gazing out over the Clearwater Basin, now illuminated by the soft lighting of the new center. "Everything okay, Dad?" he asked, joining his father on the hillside. Harrison nodded, his expression peaceful. "Just remembering. Your grandfather stood on this spot when he decided to buy this land back in 1947. He said he could feel it was good ground, not just fertile, but honest somehow." Alexander smiled at the characteristically poetic farmer's way of describing soil quality. He was right. "When we lost the farm," Harrison continued, "I thought that connection was broken, that all the knowledge I'd accumulated over decades would die with me." He gestured toward the center below, where visitors were still exploring the exhibits and walking the demonstration fields. "Never imagined any of this." "You didn't just save a watershed, Dad," Alexander said quietly. "You started a movement." Harrison shook his head modestly. "I just spoke up about something I knew. It was you and even Blackwood who turned it into something bigger." As they stood together under the emerging stars, a group of students from Maya's agricultural program approached, respectfully asking if Harrison would be willing to share some of his observations about the seasonal changes he'd documented over the years. "The meteorologists are predicting drought this summer," one young man explained, "but Mr. Blackwood mentioned you have records of how the Clearwater Basin responds to dry periods going back decades." Harrison's eyes lit up at the genuine interest. Opening his ever-present notebook, he began showing the students his careful documentation of water levels, plant indicators, and soil conditions during previous drought cycles. "See these patterns?" he explained, pointing to his hand-drawn charts. "When the silver maples along the North Creek turn early, we typically see below-average rainfall for the next 6 to 8 weeks. But the natural springs in the eastern section maintain their flow if you don't overdraw them in the early dry period." The students clustered around, recording his observations on their tablets and asking thoughtful follow-up questions. The integration of his empirical knowledge with their scientific training created a powerful synthesis, exactly the kind of knowledge transfer the center had been designed to facilitate. Alexander stepped back, watching with profound satisfaction as his father's lifetime of careful observation found new life in the next generation of agricultural stewards. This, he realized, was the true success of their initiative, not the buildings or programs, but the transmission of wisdom that might otherwise have been lost. Nearby, Victor Blackwood observed the scene with similar appreciation. When he had first dismissed Harrison as a stubborn old farmer with outdated methods, he had failed to recognize the wealth of practical knowledge the man possessed. Knowledge that now formed the core of their revolutionary approach to agricultural land management. Later, as the evening wound down and visitors began to depart, Blackwood approached Harrison, who was still engaged with the students. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Blackwood said, "but I wanted to let you know that the Riverview property we discussed last month is coming available. The owner specifically requested that you be involved in the knowledge documentation process before it goes to market." Harrison nodded. "I knew Jim Riverview's father. That bottomland floods in a particular pattern that isn't obvious until you've seen it through a few spring seasons. Exactly why the current owner wants your input," Blackwood confirmed. 5 years ago, that knowledge would have been ignored. Today, it's considered essential due diligence for any serious buyer. This transformation in how agricultural knowledge was valued represented perhaps the most profound change the Miller-Blackwood Protocol had introduced. What had once been dismissed as anecdotal or subjective was now recognized as a form of expertise that complemented rather than competed with scientific analysis. As Harrison agreed to visit the Riverview property the following week, Alexander rejoined them, accompanied by the visiting agricultural commissioners. "Gentlemen," Alexander said, "I believe we have genuine cause for celebration. Not only is the protocol expanding to 3 additional states, but the Federal Agricultural Department has expressed interest in incorporating its principles into national land transfer guidelines." Blackwood's eyebrows rose in surprise. "National implementation? That's moving faster than we anticipated." "Because it works," Harrison said simply, "not just environmentally, but economically." This practical effectiveness had been the key to the protocol's rapid adoption. Rather than positioning environmental protection as a sacrifice that farmers and investors needed to make for the greater good, the Miller-Blackwood approach demonstrated that ecological stewardship enhanced both short-term viability and long-term prosperity. Before departing, the 3 architects of this agricultural revolution, Harrison, Alexander, and Blackwood, took one final walk through the demonstration fields. Under the moonlight, the healthy soil and vibrant cover crops testified to the success of their integrated approach. "You know," Blackwood mused, "when I first agreed to this partnership, I was mainly trying to save my business reputation. I never expected to find it so personally fulfilling." Alexander nodded. "There's something deeply satisfying about work that aligns profit with purpose." Harrison, walking slightly ahead, stopped to kneel and scoop up a handful of rich soil, crumbling it between his fingers with the practiced assessment of a lifelong farmer. "Living soil," he said with quiet satisfaction. More organisms in this handful than there are people on Earth. When I was escorted out of that symposium, this is what I was really trying to protect. Not just water or land, but this miracle that feeds us all. As he released the soil back to the earth, the gesture seemed to symbolize the protocol's core philosophy, that land was not merely a possession to be exploited, but a living trust to be nurtured. In that moment, three men from vastly different backgrounds and initial perspectives shared a common appreciation for the transformation they had initiated. What had begun as a humiliating confrontation had evolved into a collaborative vision that honored both economic realities and ecological imperatives. As they returned to the center, the building's soft lighting welcomed them back, a beacon of a new approach to agriculture that balanced innovation with tradition, profit with stewardship, and human needs with natural systems. The Clearwater Basin Sustainable Agriculture Center would continue to evolve in the years ahead, adapting to new challenges and opportunities. But its founding principle would remain constant, that the wisdom of those who had worked the land for generations deserved respect, and that when such wisdom was integrated with modern knowledge, the result was not compromise, but synergy. And it had all begun because an elderly farmer refused to remain silent when important knowledge was being ignored, and because those with power eventually had the wisdom to listen. 15 years later, the National Agricultural Stewardship Conference held in Washington, D.C., buzzed with energy as representatives from farming communities across the country gathered to exchange ideas about sustainable land management and preservation of agricultural heritage. The grand ballroom of the conference center was filled to capacity for the keynote address, a presentation on the transformative impact of what was now widely known as the Miller-Blackwood model. At the podium stood Dr. Maya Johnson, now 35, and the executive director of the Rural Sustainability Institute, one of the country's leading voices on agricultural policy. Behind her, a large screen displayed the now iconic photograph taken 20 years earlier at the Emerald Valley Summit. Harrison Miller and Victor Blackwood standing side by side, their unlikely alliance having sparked a movement that had spread far beyond their small community. 20 years ago, Dr. Johnson began, an elderly farmer was escorted out of an investment symposium for attempting to share information about a watershed covenant on land being sold for industrial development. That seemingly small moment of conflict has resulted in what many now recognize as the most significant reform in agricultural land management of the past half-century. In the front row sat Alexander Miller, now in his late 60s and recently retired after serving as CEO of GreenHarvest Global for 2 decades. Beside him sat Victor Blackwood, now in his 70s, but still actively involved in the rural land stewardship programs he had helped establish. Harrison Miller was no longer with them, having passed away peacefully 5 years earlier at the age of 83, but his presence was felt throughout the conference that had dedicated its proceedings to his memory. The Miller-Blackwood model began as a local response to a specific conflict, Dr. Johnson continued, but its principles have proven remarkably adaptable across diverse agricultural contexts. Today, 43 states have adopted some version of the integrated assessment protocols that began in the Clearwater Basin, and federal agencies now incorporate traditional knowledge documentation in all agricultural land transactions involving government funding. The transformation that had begun with one confrontation at a rural investment symposium had gradually expanded into a comprehensive approach to land management that bridged divides between environmental concerns, economic interests, and cultural preservation. What Victor Blackwood had initially viewed as an unwelcome complication to his business model had evolved into a framework that created value for all stakeholders in the agricultural ecosystem. Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Johnson noted. We've seen a 58% reduction in water rights litigation in regions that have fully implemented the model, along with measurable improvements in soil health, watershed integrity, and rural economic resilience. When we honor the knowledge of those who have worked the land for generations, we make better decisions about its future. After the keynote address, the conference broke into specialized sessions, with Victor Blackwood leading a workshop on reforming investment practices to better serve both financial returns and land health. The man who had once mockingly dismissed a stubborn old farmer with outdated methods now championed the integration of ecological understanding into every aspect of property transactions. The key insight, Blackwood explained to his packed session, is recognizing that land carries multiple forms of value: economic, ecological, cultural, and historical. When we acknowledge all these dimensions in our transactions, we create outcomes that benefit both investors and the broader community. His approach had not just reformed his own business, but had spawned an entirely new professional certification: land stewardship advisors, specialists who bridge the gap between traditional investment services and environmental consulting. Young professionals from both rural and urban backgrounds were now pursuing careers that combined financial expertise with ecological understanding, many of them inspired by the story of how Blackwood's confrontation with Harrison Miller had led to his own profound transformation. In another conference room, Alexander Miller participated in a panel discussion on integrating agricultural heritage into economic development strategies. Though no longer heading GreenHarvest, his influence on agricultural policy remained substantial through his foundation work and advisory roles. The real lesson from the Clearwater Basin, he told the audience, wasn't just about protecting one watershed or one covenant. It was about recognizing that the knowledge held by long-term stewards of the land represents intellectual capital that deserves both respect and compensation. This principle had manifested in the creation of a radical new approach to property evaluation, one that factored in knowledge equity alongside traditional measures of land value. Farmers who had documented generations of observations about their land could now monetize this intellectual property when transitioning their operations, creating financial recognition for wisdom that had previously been dismissed as merely anecdotal. During the conference luncheon, Alexander found himself seated with a group of young farmers from diverse backgrounds, all participants in the Harrison Miller Fellowship Program that provided training in both traditional agricultural knowledge and modern sustainable techniques. My grandmother's farm was being sold for industrial agriculture when she heard about the Miller-Blackwood approach, explained one young woman from Georgia. The comprehensive assessment revealed unique microclimatic conditions that made the property far more valuable for specialty crop production than for commodity farming. Now I'm operating a successful organic orchard on land that almost became another anonymous soybean operation. Similar stories echoed around the table, tales of farms saved, watersheds protected, and rural heritage preserved through the application of principles that had emerged from that fateful confrontation 20 years earlier. As the conference continued into its second day, attendees toured the newly established National Agricultural Knowledge Repository, a digital and physical archive that documented traditional farming practices, ecosystem observations, and land management techniques from rural communities across America. The repository's central hall featured a life-sized bronze statue of Harrison Miller, depicted sitting on a fence with his notebook open, eternally recording his observations of the land he loved. Victor Blackwood paused before the statue, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The man he had once dismissed as irrelevant had left a legacy that would influence agricultural practices for generations to come. He would have been embarrassed by all this attention, Alexander Miller commented, joining Blackwood beside his father's likeness. Blackwood nodded in agreement. He never wanted recognition, he just wanted the watershed to be respected. "And now it is," Alexander replied, in ways none of us could have imagined that day at the symposium. They stood in companionable silence, these once adversaries whose conflict had yielded not to bitterness, but to a productive partnership that had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others across rural America. Later that evening, at the conference's formal dinner, Victor Blackwood received the inaugural Harrison Miller Stewardship Award for his role in developing and promoting sustainable land transaction practices. As he accepted the honor, he reflected on the irony of receiving an award named for a man he had once had removed from his investment symposium. "Harrison Miller taught me the most valuable lesson of my career," Blackwood told the assembled guests. "He showed me that the true value of land cannot be measured solely in dollars per acre. Its worth lies in the complex web of relationships, ecological, cultural, and economic, that sustain both the land itself and the communities that depend upon it." He held up the award, a small bronze replica of Harrison's weathered notebook. "I accept this honor with humility, knowing that my greatest contribution was simply having the wisdom to listen when a farmer tried to teach an investor about what really matters." The applause that followed reflected not just appreciation for Blackwood's remarks, but recognition of the broader principle they embodied: that transformation often begins with conflict, but can lead to collaboration when people remain open to growth and learning. After the ceremony, Alexander Miller invited Blackwood to join him on the conference center's terrace, which offered a sweeping view of the capital city. As they looked out over the illuminated monuments, he handed Blackwood a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "I found this while going through Dad's things," Alexander explained. "I think he would have wanted you to have it." Blackwood carefully unwrapped the package to reveal Harrison Miller's leather notebook, the same one he had clutched during that confrontation 20 years earlier. The pages were filled with meticulous observations about weather patterns, soil conditions, and water flows, alongside philosophical reflections about stewardship and responsibility. "I can't accept this," Blackwood said, deeply moved by the gesture. "This belongs in the repository with his other papers." Alexander shook his head. "The repository has his other notebooks, but this one, the one he had with him that day, I think he would want it to remind you of how far you've both come." Blackwood carefully opened the worn cover, noticing for the first time an inscription on the inside page, a quote Harrison had written decades earlier. "The measure of our lives is not what we accumulate, but what we preserve for those who follow." "He was working on a book, you know," Alexander said quietly. "In those last few years, he finished it just before he passed. It's being published next month. The Land Remembers, a farmer's philosophy of stewardship." "I'll be first in line to buy it," Blackwood replied, still carefully holding the notebook that represented both his greatest professional misstep and the beginning of his most meaningful work. As they returned to the conference, they passed an exhibit showcasing the impact of the Miller-Blackwood model across diverse agricultural communities. Photographs of restored watersheds, thriving family farms, and collaborative land management. Projects that bridged traditional divides between environmental and economic interests. One display particularly caught their attention: a map showing the spread of the model from the Clearwater Basin outward like ripples expanding across a pond. What had begun as a local conflict had eventually influenced land management practices in communities across the country and was now being adapted for international applications. "Did you ever imagine it would go this far?" Alexander asked, studying the map. Blackwood shook his head. "I was just trying to save my business after your father and your helicopter upended my symposium. But somewhere along the way, I discovered there was more satisfaction in doing things right than in doing them profitably." "Though it turns out," Alexander observed, "that doing things right eventually became profitable too. It was true. Blackwood's reformed investment firm had not just survived the transition, but had thrived, becoming the industry leader in sustainable agricultural transactions. His willingness to integrate ecological understanding and traditional knowledge into property sales had positioned his company at the forefront of a significant shift in how agricultural land was valued and transferred. The conference concluded the following day with a ceremonial planting of heritage apple trees on the grounds of the Department of Agriculture, saplings propagated from stock grown at the Clearwater Basin Sustainable Agriculture Center, which had become a national model for integrated farming and education facilities. As participants gathered for the planting, Dr. Maya Johnson invited Alexander Miller to share a few closing thoughts. 20 years ago, Alexander began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd, my father stood in an investment symposium, trying to protect a covenant that preserved a watershed. He wasn't fighting for his own land that had been sold years before. He was standing up for principles that transcended property ownership. He gestured toward the young trees waiting to be planted. These saplings carry genetic material that my father preserved on our family farm decades ago, varieties that might otherwise have been lost. Like the principles he defended, they represent a living connection between past and future, a reminder that our role is not to consume resources, but to steward them for generations yet to come. As he spoke, Victor Blackwood found himself thinking about how completely his understanding of value had transformed since that confrontation. The man who had once measured success in commission percentages and sale prices now found deeper satisfaction in transactions that honored both the land itself and the knowledge of those who tended it. When the ceremonial planting was complete, the conference participants gathered for a final photograph, representatives from farming communities across the nation standing together beneath a banner that read, "The Land Remembers, Honoring the Miller-Blackwood Legacy." The phrase had become shorthand for an approach that valued agricultural heritage not as nostalgia, but as vital knowledge essential for sustainable future development. And it had all begun with an elderly farmer being escorted from an investment symposium and a CEO's helicopter arriving just in time to transform humiliation into opportunity. As Blackwood prepared to return home the next morning, he took one last look at Harrison Miller's notebook, running his fingers over the worn leather cover that had witnessed so much. Inside were not just observations about soil and water, but a philosophy that had changed countless lives, including his own. "The land remembers," Blackwood murmured, echoing Harrison's words from that first confrontation. "And thanks to you, Harrison, so do we." The notebook would occupy a place of honor in Blackwood's office, a daily reminder that the most profound transformations often begin with moments of conflict, and that wisdom sometimes comes from those we are initially most inclined to dismiss. The stubborn old farmer with outdated methods had indeed been traditional in his approach after decades of working the land. But his spirit and wisdom remained vibrant, continuing to influence how Americans thought about their relationship to the earth, long after that dramatic day when a CEO's helicopter had shut down an investment symposium and started a movement. 25 years later, on a crisp autumn morning, hundreds gathered at the Clearwater Basin Sustainable Agriculture Center for a special anniversary celebration. What had begun as a local initiative had blossomed into an international model for agricultural stewardship, with delegations from 5 continents arriving to study its integrated approach. The center itself had expanded dramatically, now encompassing over 3,000 acres of demonstration farms, research facilities, and educational spaces. Yet at its heart remained the original Miller family barn, preserved as a reminder of where it all began. Alexander Miller, now in his 70s, moved more slowly than he once had, but still commanded attention as he addressed the gathering from the same porch where the center had been inaugurated 20 years earlier. "A quarter century ago," he began, "my father stood in an investment symposium and spoke up for a watershed covenant that many considered irrelevant. Today, that same watershed supplies clean water to over 50,000 people and supports some of the most productive and sustainable farms in the nation." The audience included an extraordinary mix of people: farming families who had worked the region's land for generations, corporate executives whose companies had adopted the Miller-Blackwood principles, environmental scientists whose research had validated its approach, and most significantly, young farmers from around the world who had come to learn the integrated methods pioneered here. The greatest legacy of the Miller-Blackwood model isn't measured in acres protected or dollars generated, Alexander continued. It's measured in relationships healed and perspectives transformed. What began as a confrontation between seemingly opposed interests, tradition versus progress, profit versus protection, has become a demonstration that these are false dichotomies. In the front row sat Victor Blackwood, now in his early 80s. Though his hair had turned completely white and his once imposing frame had grown frail, his mind remained sharp, and his commitment to the principles he had once resisted remained unwavering. Beside him sat Maya Johnson, who had gone from scholarship, recipient to globally recognized expert on sustainable agriculture. "My father and Victor Blackwood showed us that the most valuable innovation isn't always a new technology or technique," Alexander said, gesturing toward Blackwood. "Sometimes it's a new way of seeing, recognizing the value in what has always been there, but has been systematically overlooked or dismissed." This philosophic shift, from seeing land as merely a commodity to recognizing it as a complex living system with inherent value beyond its market price, had gradually permeated agricultural policy at every level. What began as a fringe perspective had become mainstream, not through ideological battles, but through practical demonstrations of its effectiveness. After the formal speeches, attendees dispersed throughout the center for specialized workshops and demonstrations. In one classroom, elderly farmers shared their observational techniques with international students, showing how to read the land's subtle indicators of health and stress. In research laboratories, scientists developed new methods for quantifying and documenting traditional knowledge to integrate it with modern analytical approaches. Most impressively, on the demonstration fields, cutting-edge agricultural technology operated alongside traditional practices. Autonomous electric tractors programmed with seasonal patterns documented by generations of farmers, precision irrigation, systems designed around natural water flows observed over decades, biodiversity corridors maintained according to migratory patterns noted in farming journals dating back a century. Victor Blackwood found himself drawn to the original barn, now converted into a museum chronicling the center's history. Inside, a special exhibit commemorated Harrison Miller, featuring his notebooks, tools, and photographs. At its center stood a glass case containing the weathered leather chair from his farmhouse kitchen, the place where he had sat every evening to record his observations about the land's daily changes. As Blackwood stood before the exhibit, a group of international visitors entered, led by a young guide explaining the center's founding. "And this," the guide said, indicating Blackwood, "is Victor Blackwood himself, one of our two founders and the living embodiment of the transformation we hope to inspire." The visitors looked at Blackwood with something approaching reverence, requesting photographs and asking for his insights. The investment facilitator who had once dismissed Harrison Miller now found himself elevated to something of a folk hero, the man who had had the courage to change completely when presented with a better way. Later, during the celebration dinner, Held in the centre's great hall, Blackwood was asked to share a few reflections on the 25th anniversary. Rising slowly with the aid of a cane, he surveyed the room filled with people whose lives had been touched by the model that bore his name alongside Harrison's. "I'm often given too much credit," he began, his voice softer than in his symposium. Days, but still carrying quiet authority. "The truth is, I resisted this approach until circumstances forced me to reconsider. Harrison Miller had the wisdom from the beginning. I merely had the good fortune to recognize it before it was too late." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "There's a concept in investment called sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue a behavior or endeavor because of previously invested resources, even when changing course would be more beneficial. 25 years ago, I was deeply invested in a way of doing business that prioritized short-term gains over long-term stewardship." Blackwood looked toward Alexander Miller, acknowledging their shared journey. "What Harrison and Alexander showed me was that the greatest return on investment comes not from exploiting resources, but from nurturing them. That true wealth isn't measured in quarterly profits, but in generational resilience." As the celebration continued into the evening, a special announcement was made. The Clearwater Basin Center would be expanding its model internationally, with sister centers being established on 5 continents, each adapted to local agricultural traditions and ecological conditions. This global expansion represented the fulfillment of a vision that had seemed impossible 25 years earlier, when Harrison Miller stood alone at the back of an investment symposium, clutching his notebook and trying to speak up for a watershed, a covenant. As the evening wound down, Alexander Miller and Victor Blackwood found themselves standing together on the center's observation deck, looking out over the moonlit fields that stretched toward the horizon, living testimony to the principles they had championed. "Your father would have been proud," Blackwood said softly, "not of the recognition, but of what's happening on the land." Alexander nodded. "He used to say that the true measure of good farming isn't what you see above ground, but what's happening in the soil. By that standard, we're succeeding beyond anything we could have imagined." Below them, the Clearwater Basin stretched out in the moonlight, its streams and wetlands intact, its soil rich with life, its productivity enhanced rather than diminished by sustainable practices. What had nearly become another anonymous industrial operation had instead become a global model for integrated stewardship. "You know what amazes me most?" Blackwood reflected. "That all of this began because your father refused to stay silent when he saw something important being ignored. One man with the courage to speak up changed the course of agricultural history." Alexander smiled, remembering his father's quiet determination. He never saw himself as doing anything special. He just couldn't bear to see knowledge that might help others go to waste. As they watched the moon rise over the Clearwater Basin, these once adversaries stood in companionable silence, contemplating the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun in conflict had blossomed into collaboration, and what had started as a local dispute had grown into a global movement. The elderly investment facilitator who had once had Harrison Miller escorted from his symposium for disrupting business now dedicated his remaining years to ensuring that farmers' wisdom would continue to guide agricultural practices long after. Both of them were gone. Their initial antagonism had yielded not to continued conflict, but to collaborative wisdom that neither could have developed alone. A powerful testament to the possibility that even the most difficult confrontations could become catalysts for growth rather than causes for division. And it had all begun with a moment in an investment symposium, An elderly farmer standing up for principles that transcended property rights, a CEO's helicopter arriving just in time, and the willingness of people on both sides to grow beyond their initial positions towards something wiser and more enduring than either could have created alone. As Blackwood prepared to leave the next day, he visited the center's memorial garden one last time. There, beneath a spreading oak tree, stood a simple granite marker with words taken from Harrison's beloved notebook. "The land remembers how it has been treated. Our responsibility is to ensure those memories nurture rather than haunt future generations." Placing his hand on the cool stone, Blackwood felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with his most humiliating professional moment had led to his greatest contribution, helping to create a framework that honored both prosperity and stewardship, that respected both innovation and tradition. "Thank you, old friend," he whispered to Harrison's memory, "for having the courage to speak up and for giving me the chance to listen." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.